The drop pod rumbled as it pierced the upper atmosphere of Varel 7, a frozen moon orbiting the gas giant Dromore. The inside of the cabin glowed in soft amber. The artificial lighting diffused through the frost, collecting at the edges of the reinforced windows. Lena Torres sat strapped into her seat, one leg bouncing slightly out of habit, not nerves. Around her, a dozen alien cadets conversed in a mixture of languages, some vocal, others through pheromones or flickering lights on their facial membranes. She remained quiet, observant. As the only human in the class, she was used to the silence that came with being different. The drop pod landed with a mechanical thud, stabilizing itself on the icy terrain. The ramp extended with a hiss, and cold air rushed in like an invisible predator. Lena inhaled, her breath visible for just a moment before her helmet's filtration system adjusted. The wind bit through her uniform like microscopic needles. Despite the supposed insulation of her training suit, she already felt the cold sinking in. Outside, the world stretched out as a vast sheet of white. The terrain was flat with low-lying formations of jagged ice that glittered like blades under the weak light of Dromore. Snow blew horizontally in short bursts, carried by sharp winds that screamed across the plain. Distant, motionless mountains loomed like frozen titans on the horizon. Their supervising instructor, a bulky amphibious being named Commander Freyvac, stood at the head of the group. His greenish-brown skin glistened with frost, and his eyes blinked sideways behind an adaptive visor. He raised one heavy arm, signaling silence. "This is a standard wilderness survival simulation," he announced through the group's shared translator feed. "No external support. You have 48 hours. Your suits are programmed to restrict digital assistance. No AI, no comms, no replicators. The goal is to test adaptive thinking in natural conditions. Supplies are minimal, and you're expected to forage or build as necessary. The temperature is currently minus 22 degrees Celsius and falling. Dismissed." The group began to disperse. Some cadets hovered low using built-in thrusters, while others trudged awkwardly through the powdery surface. Lena adjusted her gear and stepped away from the pod, feeling the cold gnaw deeper with each breath. Her heads-up display was already malfunctioning, scrambled signals, no access to maps or weather predictions. She walked calmly, taking note of the terrain. The snow was soft on top but dense below, no danger of sudden crevasses here. The air was thin but breathable, though dry enough to make her lips crack within minutes. The others were spreading out rapidly, forming small clusters based on species or familiarity. She noticed one group of insectoid cadets beginning to erect a translucent dome using metallic filaments, but even from a distance, she could see how the wind bent the structure unnaturally. Another pair from a methane-based race had started digging into the ice itself, using laser-tipped claws. Lena scanned the area for shelter. There was no vegetation, no caves, not even a rock formation tall enough to block wind. The environment was barren in every direction, and the landscape offered no kindness. She walked toward a slightly raised ridge about 50 meters away. As she climbed, her boots sank into the snow with each step. The wind roared louder, as if furious at her intrusion. From the top of the ridge, she saw the storm front approaching. A rolling wall of gray-blue clouds stretched across the sky like the edge of a tsunami, but above them. It moved fast, unnaturally fast. She tapped her helmet, trying to activate the sensor suite again. Nothing. Static. Her brow furrowed. She switched frequencies. No connection. She tried to send a ping to Commander Freyvac. Dead signal. Either the storm had already begun disrupting the atmosphere, or this was part of the simulation. Either way, help wouldn't be coming. She turned back toward the drop zone. The dome had collapsed, its support filaments scattered like silver noodles across the snow, fluttering uselessly in the wind. The insectoids had retreated, dragging injured members toward a half-dug trench. The methane breathers had vanished entirely. She hoped they'd found something, but doubted it. Lena descended the ridge and returned to her pack. She retrieved the emergency survival kit issued before deployment. one thermal blanket, a collapsible shovel, a water filtration straw, and a redundant knife. It was laughably basic, designed to test, not to protect. The cold was getting worse. Her gloves had already stiffened. She clenched and unclenched her hands, forcing blood flow. The suit's heaters were flickering, underpowered, perhaps throttled on purpose. This wasn't about surviving with tech. This was about survival, period. She looked up as the sky darkened. The storm had arrived. The wind howled like an animal, and the snow transformed into horizontal shards of ice. Visibility dropped to less than 10 meters. One of the cadets nearby stumbled and collapsed. His suit was visibly failing, heat signatures fading from his back. She rushed to him, flipping him over. His exosuit's internal layer had frozen. She couldn't see his face beneath the visor, but his breathing was shallow. No backup battery, no warmth left. Lena dragged him toward the wreckage of the insectoid dome and managed to get his upper body into a partial trench, shielding him from the worst of the wind. It wouldn't be enough, but at least he wouldn't freeze upright. She stood again, back to the wind, thinking. The storm was not just an obstacle, it was a message. This wasn't a test of strength or speed, it was a test of sense, logic. Real survival came from the environment, not against it. Her training, unlike the others, had involved actual wilderness conditions, Alaskan winters, Siberian drills, and survival in hostile zones on Earth. Cold, unforgiving places that didn't care who she was or what species she belonged to. She started moving. She headed toward the edge of the plains, hoping to find something, anything, that wasn't ice. The landscape blurred in the gale, but she noticed odd mounds half buried in the snow. She reached one and dug with her hands. Underneath was a cluster of thick, spongy growths, dark green, with tiny crystalline fibers across their surface. She touched one. It pulsed faintly with warmth. That was all the confirmation she needed. The moss retained heat. Nearby, she found a patch of bark-like material shed from a vine-like structure embedded deep into the ice. It was surprisingly flexible and didn't shatter under pressure. She took off her outer jacket layer and began lining the inside with moss, pressing it tight to the fabric. She wrapped her arms and chest, secured it with strips of bark, and used the remaining moss to fill her boots. The insulation was crude, but real. The wind lashed harder, but she no longer shivered. She turned back toward the other cadets. Some were huddled in small groups, their suits failing visibly, frost forming across visors, movement slowing. None of them had looked for resources. None had considered nature as an ally. She realized then, it wasn't arrogance that endangered them. It was reliance on systems, on tech, on predictability. But nature didn't care about predictability. Neither did survival. The human didn't freeze. And in that moment she understood. She would have to teach the others, or bury them. By the time Lena returned to the trench where she had left the collapsed cadet, the storm had reached its full intensity. The wind screamed without rhythm, battering her from all sides. Ice particles sliced through the air like invisible razors, and visibility had dropped to barely a meter. The temperature felt impossibly low. Any exposed skin would have frozen in seconds. Her makeshift moss-lined jacket was holding, but even with the insulation, her legs were beginning to feel like stone. She knelt beside the cadet, brushing the snow from his helmet. His face was pale, motionless, but he was still breathing, barely. She needed to find a way to shield him fully, or he wouldn't survive the next hour. Lena looked around and noticed others now close to the edge. One cadet, a tall, crystalline species with translucent skin, was sitting with her knees drawn to her chest, softly humming in a high frequency that only certain sensors could detect. Her luminous veins had dimmed, signaling internal shutdown from cold exposure. Not far off, a pair of fur-covered cadets from a desert-adapted species were attempting to heat a pile of stones using their built-in plasma coils, but the coils flickered and died as the storm's electromagnetic interference grew stronger. The entire group was unraveling. She watched as another cadet, an aquatic-breathing male from the Typhon sector, curled beside a collapsed tent structure. His breathing was erratic. His suit had cracked near the chest plate, and the internal fluid that allowed his gill membranes to function in cold environments had frozen into a slush. He would suffocate soon if not kept warm. Lena stood still for a moment, forcing herself to focus. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. The others, so proud, so well-equipped, so intellectually confident, were not built for this kind of elemental warfare. No training simulation, no advanced engineering, no mental exercise had prepared them for a place where the cold crept in like a parasite and ate away at the body from the inside. And still, no signal came from the command pod. She returned to the ridge she had scouted earlier, dragging a collapsed vine carcass she had ripped from the ice. The strange plant was tough, like a mixture of tree root and dried ligament, but when crushed between stones, it released thick strands of fibrous pulp. It smelled pungent, like sulfur and wet soil, but it clung together, resisting wind and cold. She had tested it briefly before leaving the site, and now she moved quickly, using it as thread to fasten bark and moss into larger patches. She worked with cold, stiff fingers. Every knot felt like a lifetime, but her breathing remained steady. She wasn't panicking like the others. Her training on Earth had included field repair, material improvisation, and staying rational under pressure. She now needed to become more than just the quiet outsider in this group. She had to become their solution. The second time she passed the makeshift trench, a new cadet had joined the collapsed one. He was rocking back and forth, muttering in his native tongue. His black-gloved fingers were clamped tightly around the edge of his helmet, as if that alone could keep him grounded. Lena crouched down, lifted his face shield slightly, and looked into his eyes. He was young, even by alien standards, maybe equivalent to a 17-year-old human. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice sharp but calm. The translation device embedded in his collar relayed it in a low hum. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he blinked twice, a signal among his kind that meant confusion mixed with shame. She placed a strip of moss-lined bark into his gloved hands. "Wrap it around your torso, tight. It traps warmth. You need to stay awake." Still no words, but his hands moved, slowly and clumsily, following her instructions. She pulled his companion further into the shallow trench and pressed more moss to his neck and chest. It wouldn't restore warmth, but it might slow the decline. She moved again, now to the group by the shattered tent. The storm had blown the lightweight structure apart. Its carbon rods had snapped like twigs. Two cadets sat huddled beside it, clutching a flickering heat panel that had run out of charge. One of them, a broad-shouldered male with exoskeletal ridges on his face, stood and growled as Lena approached. "Back off," he barked, the translator distorting his tone with mechanical tension. "We don't need you." She didn't flinch. "Your heat panel is dead. We'll fix it." She glanced at it. The internal capacitor was fused. "It's fried. You won't fix it out here, not in this." He scoffed. "I'm not taking scraps from a primate." Lena stepped closer. Her eyes narrowed beneath the visor. "Then freeze," she said simply, and turned to leave. The cadet's companion, a thinner female of the same species, grabbed his arm. "Take it. Just take it," she urged. Lena knelt and unfastened one of the insulated panels she had crafted. It was crude but layered with warmth-retaining moss and tied with vine pulp that had hardened slightly into a semi-rigid frame. She handed it to the female and turned away without waiting for thanks. As she moved, she spotted a flicker of light far in the distance, dim, pulsing red. Emergency signal, but not from the instructors, from a cadet. Lena sprinted toward it. She reached a small crater where one of the methane breathers had collapsed. His helmet was half shattered, leaking cooling gas into the snow. His natural habitat was the sulfur-rich jungles of Glavarus IV. He was built for humidity, not dry Arctic winds. His skin had cracked in several places, revealing pale muscle underneath. She pulled out the emergency blanket from her pack and wrapped it around his torso, then began reinforcing it with whatever insulation she had left. His limbs had stiffened. He couldn't speak. Another cadet stumbled into view, a female with thin, semi-liquid skin protected only by a reflective suit that was no longer working. She fell beside Lena, gasping. She began. Her voice cracked, and her lips were discolored. Lena caught her shoulders. Breathe slowly. Don't speak. I'll help. The cold wasn't just stripping away heat. It was stripping away pride. Lena dragged both cadets toward a shallow indentation in the terrain, using her own body to shield them from the brunt of the wind. Her muscles burned. Her knees trembled. But she kept moving. Her brain refused to allow stillness. Stillness meant death. Hours passed. She didn't track time consciously, but her internal clock, trained from dozens of simulations, told her it had been at least 5 hours since the storm reached them. She had patched 8 cadets, some better than others. The wind had softened, but the temperature continued to fall. There was still no contact from command. She sat down for the first time, pressing her back against a frozen slab of broken bark she had used to form a barrier. Her fingers were numb. Her vision blurred from time to time, but her pulse remained steady. Around her, faint breathing told her that at least 6 lives were still with her. A few had begun to stir again, helped by her thermal improvisations. The exoskeletal male she had argued with earlier stood nearby, clutching the panel she had given away. He didn't speak, but he placed 2 bundles of moss beside her and walked off again, quietly helping another cadet dig into the snow for warmth. The breakdown had begun with arrogance, with belief that equipment would protect them. It ended with acceptance. And leadership, true leadership, came not from command posts or advanced suits, but from the one who moved first when everyone else froze, from the one who believed the environment wasn't the enemy, but a resource, from the one who refused to be just another statistic in the cold. The cold didn't ease, but Lena's clarity sharpened. Exhaustion gnawed at her limbs like hungry rats, but she refused to slow down. Her pulse had become mechanical, steady, unwavering. Around her, scattered pockets of cadets were no longer panicking. Instead, they were quiet, drained, watching her with something that resembled recognition. Not yet trust, but something closer than before. She wasn't in command. No one had said it aloud, but eyes turned toward her before any decision was made. Even when nothing was said, that silence weighed differently now, heavier. The storm had mostly passed. In its place remained a still, dry cold that seemed eternal. There was no sunlight, only pale gray light that filtered through Varel 7's hazy sky. The only sound was the soft crunch of Lena's boots as she moved, followed at a distance by 2 cadets carrying makeshift tools made of bark and broken tech. She had a goal now: build more than insulation, build structure. There was no time to waste. She led the 2 cadets toward a depression near the eastern ridge, a spot she had briefly passed before. It was sheltered on 3 sides by low ice walls, which meant less wind, less exposure. There, she stopped and pointed toward the snow-packed center. "We dig here," she said. One of the cadets, a slender female with teal-colored scales and large membrane ears, cocked her head. "Why not stay scattered?" she asked. Her voice was soft but unsteady. Lena didn't answer immediately. She knelt down and pushed the snow with her hands, revealing compacted ice beneath. She struck it with a flat piece of bark, and it cracked just enough to loosen. "If one shelter collapses," Lena finally replied, "the others nearby can respond. No one should be isolated again. We build something real now. A structure." The cadet nodded and dropped to her knees beside Lena. The other followed, and soon the sound of scraping and cracking filled the air. Wordless rhythm, productive silence. An hour passed before another pair joined them, then another. One of the methane breathers, wrapped in a thick layer of moss and bark, limped toward the trench with an armload of fibrous vines he had collected from the far edge of the field. Lena helped him lower the bundle and gave a single nod. That was enough. By midday, there were 12 of them. No instructions were given, no formal roles assigned, but tasks emerged organically. Lena gathered materials, bark, moss, thick clusters of plant tissue she had discovered under the ice. Others followed her example. Some broke apart their own damaged suits to use interior insulation as binding. Some reinforced the trench walls with packed snow and ice, and some sat, injured, exhausted, but handed tools or material when needed. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Lena used a split vine and bark combination to build a roof frame. The vine material, when twisted, hardened rapidly. She tied the corners tightly and reinforced the joints with snow, which froze into solid masses. Then she layered the roof with moss sheets held between overlapping bark shingles. The structure wasn't tall, barely enough to crouch inside, but it blocked the wind and trapped body heat. It would be enough to rest, enough to recover. She didn't speak unless she had to. Her voice had become something sacred, rare, necessary, and not to be wasted. Cadets began watching the way she moved, copying her actions exactly. When she cut moss, they cut the same way. When she checked the edge of the shelter with her fingers to test wind leaks, others copied the gesture. The moment felt surreal. A dozen alien cadets from 6 different worlds, species that had nothing in common with her, had begun moving as a unit, following the guidance of a single human girl who had no authority, no rank, no advanced equipment. Just experience and calm. As night returned, the temperature plunged further. The weak light disappeared entirely, and the landscape turned black and silver under a sky filled with slow-shifting auroras. The cadets huddled together inside the shelter, packed tightly, shoulders pressed to shoulders. Lena remained outside for a time, keeping watch, her back against the outer wall. Her hands trembled, her eyes burned, but she felt a flicker of peace. Then a sound pierced the air. It wasn't wind. It wasn't movement. It was crying. A soft, rhythmic whimper from inside the shelter. Lena turned and crawled through the entry tunnel they had dug. Inside, in the far corner, the young cadet with exoskeletal ridges had curled his arms over his head. His chest heaved with soundless sobs. No one else moved. Everyone pretended to be asleep. Lena reached for him gently and pulled his arm away from his face. His skin was rigid and cold, but his eyes were wet. "I let one of them die," he whispered through the translator. "Back at the trench. I was supposed to help him. I ran instead." Lena didn't speak. She stared at him without judgment. After a moment, she said quietly, "He's not dead." "Not yet." He looked up, surprised. "But I left him. I thought—" "You can think again," she interrupted. "In the morning, we'll bring him here. But if you waste energy blaming yourself now, you'll be too weak to help him later." He blinked slowly. "Why are you doing this? You're not like us." Lena almost smiled. Almost. "Exactly," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." The cadet wiped his face with a gloved hand and leaned back, no longer shaking. Lena stayed near him that night, her body half curled, her jacket reinforced with more moss from her last collection run. She didn't sleep. Her brain cycled through plans: what to do if the storm returned, how to scavenge more insulation, how to rotate sleeping positions to retain maximum warmth. The next morning arrived slowly. No one stirred until Lena opened the front barrier and let in a narrow stream of gray light. Her body screamed with fatigue, but she didn't falter. She walked to the trench. The cadet she had covered in moss was still breathing. Barely. She returned to the shelter and pointed at 2 of the stronger cadets. "Help me carry him," she said. They followed without question. By the time the sun rose fully, their numbers had grown again. 17 cadets, most of them wrapped in bark and moss, sat quietly around a single fireless center. The air inside the shelter was warmer now, humid from so many bodies. It smelled like sweat, earth, and strange alien biology, but it was warm. Lena stood just outside, her back to the wind, scanning the horizon. There was still no signal from command, no ships, no drones, but there was life, real, living life, and she had helped preserve it by using her hands and by trusting the earth beneath alien ice. She whispered to herself, voice carried away in the wind. Next, we build tools. By the second full cycle on Varel 7, the cold no longer felt like an enemy to Lena. It had become a constant companion, one she no longer fought, but worked around. The first night inside the shelter had drained her body nearly to collapse, but she refused to show it. While others slept in shifts or recovered from frostbite, she moved outside before the first sliver of dim light touched the horizon, her movements slow but deliberate, her legs sore, her joints stiff. She didn't complain. She had no time to. She began the day by checking the structural integrity of the main shelter. The moss had held. The bark roof, weighed down with ice, had only buckled slightly in the far left corner. She fixed it silently, using fresh vine bindings she had braided late the night before. Her fingers, though blistered and raw, still functioned, barely. By mid-morning, the others had begun to stir. A few helped her patch the walls. One cadet, a bulky male with yellow skin and tusks curling downward, quietly handed her a new bundle of moss and said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone meant everything. She had earned something stronger than rank. She had earned loyalty, but not everyone was accounted for. Lena moved beyond the perimeter they had marked with stones and ice markers, heading toward the old impact site of the drop pod. She moved cautiously, her instincts sharp. As she reached the wreckage, she found what she feared, a collapsed shelter module that had not been reoccupied. Inside, two cadets sat in silence, backs pressed together. One of them was trembling violently. The other, a short female with glowing green markings along her neck, had her eyes closed. Her breath was shallow. Lena approached slowly and crouched at the entrance. "You need to move," she said plainly. The trembling male looked at her, hollow-eyed. "It's too late," he whispered. "She hasn't spoken in hours. Her suit failed." Lena pulled off her gloves and crawled inside. She pressed her palm to the female's cheek. Still warm. Faint pulse. Just barely. "It's not too late," she replied. "Help me carry her." The male hesitated. "But she's alive. I've seen worse. Get up." He obeyed, his limbs stiff with guilt more than cold. Together they lifted the female and began the slow journey back to the main shelter. Snow kicked up around their boots. The wind howled again in long, distant bursts. The male never looked up, but Lena kept her eyes fixed forward. As they reached the shelter, others rushed to clear space. The female was wrapped in fresh moss and placed near the warmest part of the structure. Lena forced water past her lips and rubbed her limbs to stimulate circulation. It would take time, but she would live. The male sat beside her silently, refusing food until she opened her eyes. When she finally blinked, he let out a sound somewhere between a cry and a laugh. From that moment, the others began to come. Word spread. Cadets who had given up emerged from beneath broken tents, snowdrifts, and hollowed-out ridges. One by one they arrived, some crawling, others limping, all drawn by the one place where the cold didn't kill. Lena watched each arrival with the same expression, focused, composed, without judgment. She welcomed them all. By the time the sun passed behind the clouds again, the shelter held 22 cadets. It wasn't enough space. Lena stood and clapped her hands together twice. The sound was dull in the frozen air, but it got attention. "We expand," she said. No one questioned her. She divided them into groups. Some gathered more moss and bark. Others dug new trenches. The stronger cadets carried injured ones, reinforcing walls with ice bricks cut from the frozen plain. Lena led by doing, her energy never fully returning, but always visible. Her body ran on instinct now. No rest, no break, only forward motion. She built a second structure beside the first, larger, flatter, more stable. She designed it to channel wind over the top rather than allowing it to push against the walls. She constructed a drainage groove along the base using melted snow redirected with bark channels, preventing water buildup inside the floor. It was crude engineering, but it worked. By the end of the second day, the two structures stood side by side like twins, testaments to cooperation across species, temperaments, and pride. Inside, cadets whispered to one another, exchanged lessons in each other's languages, and passed scraps of food between hands. It was no longer just survival. It was community. That evening, while checking a torn section of wall, Lena heard a voice behind her. "You don't stop, do you?" She turned to see the same exoskeletal male who had challenged her 2 days earlier. His posture had changed. He no longer loomed with pride. He stood level with her, holding a bundle of vine and moss in his arms. "No," she answered. "If I stop, the next one might die." He looked down at the materials in his hands. "We were wrong about you," he admitted. "Back on the first day, we thought you were just lucky, primitive, clever maybe, but nothing more." She stared at him. "And now?" He met her eyes. "Now we think you're terrifying." She almost smiled, but her lips were cracked and too dry. "Good," she said. Later that night, as the cadets ate in silence, Lena stood alone just outside the main shelter. She looked up at the sky. The auroras had returned, curving rivers of pale green and deep blue swirling across the blackness above. The cold touched her cheeks, but didn't pierce her anymore. She had become part of this world, adapted. A faint sound reached her ears, distant movement, metal scraping against ice. She tensed, crouched low, and moved toward the sound. At the far edge of the ridge, she saw him, Commander Freyvac. His large body, partially buried in snow, was bent forward. His helmet was cracked, one arm wrapped around his torso. She rushed toward him. He lifted his head slightly. "Took longer than expected," he rasped. "You're injured," she said. "Twisted leg. Fell on the slope. No communications. No visibility. Just now. Spotted your signal flare." Lena paused. "I didn't launch a flare." He blinked slowly, confused. She looked toward the sky. No flare. Just light from the shelter's roof, bouncing off the ice and reflecting upward. Bright, steady, unmistakable. A natural beacon. She turned back to him. "You saw what we built," he grunted. "Didn't think I'd be rescued by a cadet." "You weren't," she said. "You were rescued by 22 cadets. I just started first." She helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight. Together, they walked back slowly toward the shelter. Neither spoke, but every cadet stood when they entered. No command given, no signal passed. It was instinct now. It was unity. Commander Freyvac looked around the room, his injured leg trembling beneath him. "You did this," he muttered. Lena shook her head. "Number we did." And that night, for the first time, she slept. When Lena woke, her mind resisted the idea that she had finally allowed herself to rest. For the first time in days, she hadn't jerked awake from the sound of wind, from the sudden drop of temperature, or from the quiet rustle of movement that might have meant danger. Her body ached in places she didn't realize could ache. Her fingers were swollen, skin cracked. Her back was sore from the cold floor and stiff from lying still. But her breathing was calm, and her pulse was even. There was warmth, not from heaters or systems, but from the shared presence of cadets who had once refused to stand near her. When she stepped out of the shelter, the air bit gently at her face. The storm had fully passed. The sky was clear, a pale purple streaking toward gray. Thin ice crystals floated lightly in the air, catching the low-angle sunlight in shimmering fragments. The wind, once a violent force, had calmed to a soft, constant breeze. It was beautiful, cold still, but no longer threatening. Commander Fravak was sitting near the perimeter of the shelter, his injured leg propped on a makeshift splint crafted from vine, bark, and scrap metal. His visor was off, revealing his amphibious features, his skin now a duller shade of green than usual. He had lost weight. His breathing was heavier than before, but he looked alert. Lena walked to him. "You shouldn't be upright yet," she said, not unkindly. "I've survived worse," he replied, rubbing his shoulder, "though not with a cadet hauling my limp body across frozen terrain." She didn't smile, but there was a flicker in her eyes. "You'll need help returning to the landing point when the extraction shuttle arrives," she said. "I think I'll be escorted," he muttered, glancing toward the cluster of cadets now gathered near the shelters. "They listen to you." "They listen because it works," she replied. The commander watched her for a moment. "Do you know what this exercise was originally meant to test?" She shook her head. "Adaptation, cross-species cooperation, field leadership under duress. But it was supposed to be moderated, assisted, supervised." He chuckled dryly, then winced from the pain. "Instead, my suit failed, my beacon shorted out, and I ended up half buried under snow for 2 days. You took over what I couldn't even begin." Lena remained quiet. Fravak looked down. "I was skeptical about having a human cadet in this cycle. Still am in some ways. But I've never seen anything like what you did. You didn't lead by command. You led by action, by instinct." "It wasn't instinct," Lena said. "It was memory." He raised a brow. "I remember watching my grandfather insulate a winter tent with tree bark in Alaska. I remember boiling snow on a tin can when I was 12. I remember patching a leaking tent with chewing gum on a survival hike. None of this was new. I just wasn't taught to wait for systems to fix problems." He absorbed her words in silence. A short chime broke the stillness, 3 ascending tones. Lena turned toward the sound. A triangular green light blinked in the sky, then a low hum followed. The rescue shuttle was descending from orbit. Its body shimmered in the sunlight as it cut a slow arc through the atmosphere. The shuttle doors opened before it had fully landed, and a pair of armored personnel emerged, moving quickly toward the group with scanning devices and medical kits. Cadets stood as the team arrived, forming a loose semicircle around Lena without conscious coordination. The medics moved quickly, assessing injuries, checking vitals, tagging those who required stabilization. Lena didn't speak. She only watched. After some time, a tall female officer approached her. Her uniform bore the insignia of the Galactic Academy's Command Division. Her features were sharp, her expression unreadable. "Cadet Torres?" Lena nodded. The officer pulled out a slim data tablet and pressed her thumb to the sensor. A long list of updates appeared: biometric logs, survival data, atmospheric reports, performance evaluations. She studied them for a few seconds, then looked back at Lena. "We've reviewed footage from the emergency satellite array," she said. "You were recorded building the first shelter at 0600 hours on day 1. The command protocols note that you never activated a distress beacon nor requested override authority. You took no command position officially." "I didn't have rank," Lena said. The officer tilted her head slightly. "You had something better. Influence." Lena remained silent. "The Academy will want a full report," the officer continued. "But informally, you should know. Your performance has triggered a review of training standards. There will be curriculum changes because of what you did here. What your instructors labeled as primal improvisation is being reclassified under situational superiority." Lena blinked. "Situational superiority?" "Making the best choice with the least ideal tools," the officer explained. "You turned bark and moss into survival gear. You used terrain and teamwork to maintain warmth. You treated frostbite using body heat and non-sterile insulation. Not regulation, not standard. But it worked. That matters now." Lena looked down at her hands. The skin on her palms had peeled in places. Her knuckles were raw. I wasn't trying to be superior, she said. I was trying not to bury anyone. The officer gave a small nod and turned to leave. Lena looked around. Most of the cadets had already begun boarding the shuttle. Some limped, others were supported, but all were alive. She spotted the young male with exoskeletal ridges helping the injured female up the ramp. The methane breather waved once before disappearing inside. Even the stubborn cadet who had once rejected her help paused to touch the entry rail, then turned and looked at her with a slow, deliberate nod before vanishing into the interior. Fravak was the last to board. As he passed her, he paused. "I'll be recommending your name for the Interspecies Survival Commendation," he said. Lena looked at him. "Those awards usually go to commanders." He nodded. "So does responsibility. You had both." When the shuttle lifted off, Lena sat alone at the edge of the shelter one last time. Her muscles ached, her lungs stung, but she felt something deep in her chest she hadn't in years: completion. Later, at the debriefing station in orbit, she was offered temporary quarters, food, and medical assistance. She declined everything except the meal. After she ate, she sat at a console and opened the feedback terminal assigned to her. Under Summary of Lessons Learned, she typed, "Leadership is not instruction. It is example. Survival is not domination. It is adaptation. And respect is not given. It's built. One trench, one breath, one decision at a time." She paused, then added, "The cold did not break us. It taught us what warmth truly meant." And with that, Lena Torres submitted her report and left the terminal glowing behind her, unaware that her words would soon be translated into 46 languages, archived into every planetary syllabus under human crisis tactics, and quoted by instructors who had never seen snow in their lives. Because she didn't come to teach, she came to survive, and in doing so, she taught them all.